Hello everyone, my name is Navraj Singh. I am from Sandalwood Heights Secondary School, grade 11. And as we discussed in the last podcast, I am researching indigenous stories and sharing them with all of you. So today's podcast is about Voices of the Land, Indigenous Narratives. This is episode 7, a journey into Indigenous Resistance and Resurgence. The podcast will last about 22 minutes and was recorded on 8 May 2024 at 4 o'clock. First, let's start with today's sponsor.
The rarest, the best, the source. It's in the number one in the Native American jewelry source in the world. Here you can buy expensive jewelries at a low cost, made by indigenous people. You can buy bracelets, ties, buckles, belts, earrings, necklace, pendants, pins, rings. Come and buy from Native Arts or online. The link will be posted in the description. A tribe called Red, electric pow-wow drum, an indigenous music made for everyone, so we can all listen with its modern music style. Come and check out the link in the description to listen to this masterpiece.
What a nice sponsor. Like the last time that we discussed general indigenous history and how they resist, some for today we are focusing on a poem called Canada I Can Cite For You 150 by Christi Belcourt. This poem talks about the Resistance 150 project that indigenous people created. I will divide our sections today into 3 parts. In the first part, I will discuss the author and her life. The second part is more about the history, culture and global connection that I can make with the poem. Lastly, I will talk about my connections and review about the overall poem and what I have learned so far. So let's start with the first topic about the author. Let's fade in. Okay, so let's talk about the author of this poem. To remind everyone, the poem is called Canada I Can Cite For You 150. The author of the poem is Christi Belcourt. She is a Canadian artist and author. She is especially known for her paintings that are inspired by Métis and First Nation history. She is legally Canadian, but her origins are from Métis. Her family's community is from Manitou, Saskatchewan, Alberta. Because she is a visual artist, she also wrote 3 books and used her paintings for her book cover. Her works often focus on questions around identity, culture, place, and community division, as her art speaks to the struggles for indigenous identity, sovereignty, that means supreme power. She is also known for her activism, which focuses on indigenous issues related to justice, education, and reconciliation. So, did Christi Belcourt write any books? The answer is yes. She has written several books, including Medicines That Help Us. This is her first book that she made in 2007. It is based on her painting of the same name and includes 27 high-quality prints of her paintings. The second book is called Kitnashak, Our Missing and Murdered Indigenous Sisters, written in 2018. This is a collection of essays edited by Belcourt, Kim Anderson, and Maria Campbell. Usually her artwork explores the beauty of the natural world and reflects the connection with nature and human beings. Her art also speaks about the struggle for indigenous identity and sovereignty. Her poem, Canada I Can Cite For You 150, was part of the Resistance 150 project. This project was a reaction to Canada's 150 celebration and aimed to highlight the many ways indigenous people have historically resisted and continue to resist It lists 150 instances of various issues faced by indigenous communities, such as the lack of drinkable water and the number of indigenous children taken into care. It also cites 150 forms of resistance and resurgence among indigenous peoples. So we just talked about the author of the poem that we are analyzing, and at the same time learning more about indigenous people. So let's start to analyze topic 2. It was about historical, cultural and global connections. Let's fade it in again. Okay, so let's talk about historical, cultural and global connection. So historical context. The poem references the historical struggles of indigenous people in Canada, such as the loss of languages, the poisoning of rivers, and the taking of indigenous children into care. And this led to three problems. Problem number one, language loss. Many indigenous languages in Canada are facing extinctions. Some languages are still alive, while others have already been lost completely. Colonization and the establishment of residential schools also play a role in the loss of languages, attempting to eradicate indigenous cultures and languages. However, not all of these efforts were successful. Problem number two, river poisoning. So indigenous communities have suffered from environmental harm due to colonization and globalization and dispossession of lands and resources. Because of the poisoning of rivers and degradation of natural habitats, indigenous people got disrupted in their traditions, life and connection to the land. Problem number 3, child warfare system. Policies such as the 60s Scoop and the Indian residential school system forcibly separated children from their cultural heritage, and when indigenous people move from to urban areas, they lose a physical connection to their homeland, making it harder to retain their languages. Next, let's talk about cultural context. The poem highlights various aspects of indigenous culture, including naming ceremonies, dances, songs, tattoo, expression of sovereignty. This achieves three things. 1. Cultural awareness. It educates us on the richness and diversity of indigenous culture, including naming ceremonies, dances, songs, and tattooed expression of sovereignty. This can encourage understanding and respect for this tradition. 2. Preservation of heritage. The poem helps to preserve indigenous cultural heritage by documenting and celebrating these practices. This is particularly important in a world where many indigenous cultures are under threat. 3. Expression of identity. The poem allows the indigenous community to express their identity and assert their sovereignty. This can be empowering and affirming for indigenous people. Now let's talk about global context. The poem can be seen as a global issue. It speaks to the universal struggle of indigenous peoples around the world who have faced similar challenges due to colonization. This led to three things: historical and ongoing struggle. The poem cites 150 languages no longer spoken and 150 indigenous community without water. This line speaks to the loss of the cultural heritage and basic human rights, issues that indigenous community face due to colonization. 2. Resistance and resilience. The poem mentions 150 forms of resistance and 150 battles to the death. These lines underscore the resilience of indigenous people in the face of adversity and their ongoing fight for justice and recognition. 3. Hope for the future. The poem ends in a hopeful note, envisioning 150 summers coming of resurgence and 150,000 indigenous words being spoken without English. These lines suggest a future where indigenous cultures thrive and their languages and traditions are preserved and respected. This poem represents the past pain, the present struggle, and the hope for a better future for indigenous people. Now, what's the historical accuracy? The poem references specific historical events and struggles faced by indigenous people in Canada, such as the loss of languages and the taking of indigenous children into care. What's the cultural accuracy? The poem mentions various elements of indigenous culture, such as naming ceremonies, dances, and songs. What about the global content's accuracy? The poem colonialism and its impact is a global issue that resonates with indigenous communities worldwide. So now let's talk about the 4 R's. So if you don't know what the 4 R's are, I will teach you right now. So the 4 R's are resistance, resilience, reclamation, and resurgence. Use this to better understand indigenous life and history in the right way. So first R, resistance. The poem lists 150 forms of resistance and 150 battles to their death, highlighting the ongoing struggles of indigenous people against discriminatory and assimilation policies. 2. Resilience. The poem shows resilience for indigenous people, mentioning 150 warriors walking and 150 ways we shake the ground with dance and song. This resilience is also reflected in the ongoing survival and resistance of indigenous people. 3. Resurgence. The poem anticipates a resurgence of indigenous culture and practices with 150 summers coming of resurgence, 150,000 babies birthed with ceremonies, and 150,000 indigenous words being spoken without English. 4. Reclamation. The poem also speaks to the reclamation of indigenous lands, culture, and identities, with 150 tattooed expression of sovereignty and 150 times 2 million days forces were painting with the earth of this land. The poem also shows the resistance and resilience of indigenous people and their ongoing efforts to protect their lands and water. It also emphasizes the resurgence of indigenous languages and traditions. Okay, so topic 2 was more about the historical, culture, and global connections that are related to the poem Canada, I Can Cite For You 150. Now let's talk about the topic 3. So this is my personal connection and review. I will share my thoughts on this poem, and I encourage you to write any thoughts or ideas that are related to the poem in the comments. Personal connection and review. So aspects that resonated with me. So indigenous resistance and resilience. The poem is a part of the Resistance 150 project, which highlights the resistance and resilience on indigenous people against discrimination. Criticism of Canada's celebration. The poem criticized the celebration of Canada 150 anniversaries, pointing out the neglect of First Nation, Métis Nation, and Inuit people who have been in Canada for 15,000 years. It also criticized the spending on the celebration while many indigenous communities lack necessities. What are the little divides in the poem and what is the connection between them? So what I found out is a repetition where it says, Canada, I can cite for you. And this is in line 2, 14 and 25. This is to emphasize the numerous issues and forms of resistance faced by indigenous people in Canada. The other literary device that I found is imagery. Belcourt paints vivid picture of 150 river poisoned, line 6, 150 indigenous community without water, in line 8, and 150,000 youth marching for water, in line 30. Among others, these images serve to bring attention to the environmental and social issue faced by indigenous communities. What is the use of that? So, repetition. Each repetition brings a new issue to light, broadening the reader understanding of the challenges and resistance faced by these communities. And imagery, the vivid image painted by the words of the poem, helps the reader visualize the realities faced by indigenous communities. This can lead to a deeper understanding and empathy towards their struggle. So, how is the poem related? The poem shows the celebration of Canada's 150th anniversary, showing the many challenges indigenous communities continue to face, such as lack of access to clean drinking water and the loss of indigenous languages. It also shows the resilience of indigenous people, their resistance to these challenges, and their connection to the land. This poem gives a reminder of the importance of acknowledging and understanding the full history of a nation, including the experience of its indigenous people. So why should people read this poem? I got 5 points because of that. Indigenous perspective. The poem shows a unique perspective on the history and current state of Canada from an indigenous view. So we can have more experience and we can see what is the issue from an indigenous view. Forms of resistance. The poem shows 150 forms of resistance and 150 battles to the death, symbolizing the ongoing fight for rights and recognition by indigenous communities. Third, cultural resurgence. It also speaks of cultural resurgence with references to traditional practices like ceremonies, dance, song, and more. Critique of celebration. The poem is a critique of Canada 150 celebration, questioning the spending on the celebration while many indigenous communities still lack in necessity like potable drinking water. Clean. 5. Prominent artist. Christi Belcourt, the author, is a renowned artist and activist. Her work is recognized and respected, so the message can be spread with experience. How can this poem help indigenous and non-indigenous? So I got 4 points. Number 1, awareness. The poem wants to show us how to fix the struggles and injustice faced by indigenous people, such as the loss of languages, environmental degradation, and the taking of indigenous children into care. Number 2, recognition of resistance and resilience. The poem cites 150 forms of resistance and resilience, including battle, water, warrior, naming ceremonies, expression of sovereignty, and more. This can inspire pride among indigenous people and respect for non-indigenous people. Third, promotion of indigenous culture. The poem mentions 150 ways indigenous culture is being preserved and promoted, such as through dance, song, and tattooed expression of sovereignty. This can help to preserve and strengthen indigenous cultures. 4. Call to action. The poem ends with a call to action, a future where indigenous words are spoken without English, and where non-indigenous people come to understand the power and spirit of the land and water. This can motivate both indigenous and non-indigenous people to work towards a more fair and equal deal and understand society. So, as we discussed in this podcast, we learned a lot about indigenous people and their ongoing issues. We also learned about Christi Belcourt. She is a Canadian artist and author making paintings inspired by Métis and First Nation history. Her origins are from Métis, from Manitou, Saskatchewan, Alberta. She wrote 3 books and used her paintings for her book cover. In the poem, we analyze how Indigenous people struggled in the governing of Canada for 150 years, where Indigenous people lived more than the government of Canada, causing Indigenous people to have issues including poor water, loss of languages and children, women, lands, and much more. We also analyzed how she wrote the poem by analyzing the literacy devices. Canada, I Can Cite For You 150 expressed hope and determination for a better future. It encourages us to understand and appreciate Indigenous peoples' history and culture and recognize their significant contribution to the nation's identity. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you want to share it with your friends or someone you want to send it to, I have a summary in the description so they can have an idea about what I'm talking about in this episode. Thank you for listening. Enjoy your day and see you in the next podcast. And Navraj out. Squawk 258, clear to land on runway 28 left.